Hello, I'm Doug Wentz, and welcome to Make Moderates Matter. In September of 2024, just 6 weeks before the presidential election, I delivered a speech on the front steps of the Pennsylvania State Capitol building in Harrisburg entitled, Donald Trump's January 6th Insurrection and Endless Corruption. Why Don't You Care? In my last video, episode 3, I presented a condensed version of the first half of my speech, which focused on January 6th. In this video, I will cover the second half of my speech, which included a Donald Trump corruption timeline. Finally, in my next video, episode 5, I will move on to consider why, despite everything I covered in my speech, many moderates nevertheless voted for Trump, and how we all can work together regardless to make moderates matter. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The second half of my speech on the front steps of the Pennsylvania Capitol before the 2024 election included a Donald Trump corruption timeline that chronicled Trump's corruption, grift, and unethical conduct over the years. The following is a condensed version of that timeline. Let's begin. In November of 2016, as reported by NPR, shortly before Trump took office as president, Trump University settled 3 lawsuits for a total of $25 million. Trump University was accused by the New York Attorney General of using illegal business practices and also was sued by students who alleged that Trump University defrauded them with misleading marketing practices and high-pressure sales tactics. Trump did not admit any wrongdoing as part of the settlements, but as Ian Tuttle of the National Review, a conservative publication, reported, Trump University was a massive scam. In January of 2017, as reported by NPR and The Guardian, shortly after Trump took office, he appointed his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to a top White House job, and soon also employed his daughter, Ivanka Trump, as a top advisor. This nepotism inevitably raised numerous ethical questions. For example, as reported by Forbes, over a span of 2 months in late 2018, the Chinese government granted 18 trademarks to companies linked to President Trump and his daughter Ivanka, which apparently were fast-tracked and received other favorable treatment. Also in January of 2017, as reported by NPR, the first of 3 federal lawsuits was filed which alleged that President Trump violated the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits a person holding an office of trust from accepting any present emolument, office, or title from a foreign state without the consent of Congress. Despite advice to the contrary, Trump did not divest his business holdings while serving as president, so the lawsuits cited numerous examples of how Trump was making money by doing business with companies linked to foreign governments. The emoluments lawsuits progressed through the lower federal courts for nearly 4 years. Throughout the litigation, Trump and his legal team maintained that his business activities did not violate the emoluments clauses, which, as reported by Politico, Trump described as phony. Eventually, as reported by the AP, the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed 2 of the emoluments clause cases on procedural grounds as being moot after Trump lost the 2020 election, leaving many questions unanswered about the scope of the emoluments clauses, the definition of emolument, and who has legal standing to enforce the clauses. Nevertheless, in August of 2024, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW, reported that foreign governments paid Trump millions of dollars through his businesses. More than 150 foreign officials from 77 foreign governments patronized Trump properties and gave Trump other things of value while he was president. CREW also noted that Trump's decision not to divest from his business interests while in office set the stage for an administration marked by self-interest and more than 3,700 conflicts of interest. For example, Trump boosted his own profits by paying 145 visits to Mar-a-Lago, 33 visits to the Trump Hotel, and 328 visits to golf courses, often bringing along other government officials, making clear that his properties were open to their business. In September 2017, as reported by CNN and Politico, the first of 3 Trump cabinet secretaries resigned amid ethics scandals. That's right. Not one, not two, but three of Trump's cabinet officers, HHS Secretary Tom Price, EPA Chief Scott Pruitt, and Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, all resigned amid ethics investigations. A fourth cabinet officer also became embroiled with ethics allegations but did not resign. In June of 2018, Forbes reported that Wilbur Ross, while Commerce Secretary, owned stakes in companies co-owned by the Chinese government and failed to divest his financial holdings, contradicting his earlier written statement to the contrary. A spokesman for Ross said he did not lie, but Ross nevertheless amended his paperwork and eventually divested his holdings. In October of 2017, as reported by the LA Times, George Papadopoulos, a former Trump campaign advisor, pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about his contacts with Russian officials and a Maltese professor who told him that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton. In December of 2017, as reported by CNN, Michael Flynn, who served as Trump's national security advisor for less than a month, pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about his interactions with Russia's ambassador to the U.S. in the weeks before Trump took office. In February of 2018, as reported by CNBC, Rick Gates, the former deputy chairman of Trump's campaign, pleaded guilty to conspiracy against the U.S. and lying to investigators. In August of 2018, as reported by CNN, Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign chairman, was found guilty of tax and bank fraud. A month later, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges related to money laundering, lobbying violations, and witness tampering. Also in August of 2018, as reported by the AP and CNN, Michael Cohen, Trump's former personal lawyer and fixer, pleaded guilty to various crimes, including orchestrating the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels in the New York election interference case. Cohen also pleaded guilty in November of 2018 for lying to Congress about negotiations concerning a proposed Trump Tower in Moscow, which never materialized. In March of 2019, as reported by NPR, Special Counsel Robert Mueller submitted his final report to Trump's Attorney General William Barr regarding his investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election. The Mueller report found that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. Mueller report at page 1. For example, on July 27th of 2016, referring to Hillary Clinton, Trump said the following during a news conference: "Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will be mightily rewarded by our press." Donald Trump, Mueller report at page 57. In response, as reported by PBS News, on or around that very same day, Russian officials started to hack Hillary Clinton's email addresses. In addition, as noted in the Mueller report and reported by the AP, there was a meeting at Trump Tower in June of 2016 between three members of the Trump campaign, Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort, and a Russian lawyer, Natalia Veselnitskaya. Donald Trump Jr. made several misleading statements about the meeting and initially told the press that the purpose was to discuss adoptions of Russian children by Americans. Later, Trump Jr. admitted that he agreed to the meeting because he understood he would receive dirt regarding Hillary Clinton. "I love it," Trump Jr. had replied in an email when told of the meeting. Despite these and other substantial contacts with the Russians, Mueller concluded that there was not sufficient evidence to find a criminal conspiracy between Trump and Russia, although Mueller also concluded that Trump welcomed Russian help. In addition, the Mueller report detailed 10 instances where Trump attempted to obstruct the investigation. For example, as reported by CNN, Trump possibly obstructed justice by publicly urging ex-aides not to cooperate with the investigation and dangling pardons in exchange for their loyalty. As reported by the AP, Trump praised his former campaign chairman Paul Manafort during and after his criminal convictions and refused to rule out a pardon for him. The report did not recommend indicting Trump for these possible instances of obstruction of justice, but only because a Justice Department guideline prohibited the federal indictment of a sitting president. Notably, as reported by PBS News, Mueller specifically stated that he did not clear Trump of obstruction of justice. In June of 2019, as reported by NPR, the Office of Special Counsel called for the removal of Kellyanne Conway, a highly visible member of the Trump administration who was alleged to be a repeat offender of the Hatch Act, which forbids executive branch employees from taking part in political activities while engaged in their official duties. It was up to President Trump to remove Conway for violating the Hatch Act, but he did not. In July of 2019, as reported by CNN and the AP, one-time Trump friend Jeffrey Epstein was arrested and charged with sex trafficking minor girls. Epstein pleaded not guilty and then was jailed pending trial, but a month later was found dead in his cell of an apparent suicide. Now, to digress for a moment, at the time of my speech, that's about all I had to say about Trump and Epstein. But a lot has happened since then. The Epstein case has been much in the news as various parties have been seeking release of the government's files regarding the case. It also has been widely reported, including by the New York Times and The Guardian, that Trump and Epstein were close friends for 15 years, and details of their relationship continue to emerge. Nevertheless, to date at least, no law enforcement authorities have ever accused Trump of wrongdoing in relation to Epstein. And that's all I'm going to say about that one. In November of 2019, as reported by CNBC and The Washington Post, Roger Stone, Trump's longtime friend, confidant, and advisor, was convicted of lying under oath to lawmakers in the Russia investigation and witness tampering. In July of 2020, the day before Stone was due to report to prison, Trump commuted his sentence. In December of 2019, as reported by The Washington Post and the AP, Trump was impeached in the House on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of justice for allegedly making aid to Ukraine contingent on a public pledge to investigate his political opponent, Joe Biden. Trump ultimately was acquitted on these impeachment charges in the Senate. Nevertheless, Republican Senator Mitt Romney voted to convict, and as reported by C-SPAN, said the following on the Senate floor. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine. Republican Senator Mitt Romney. In August of 2020, as reported by CNN, Donald Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon and 3 others were indicted by federal prosecutors during the final months of Trump's 2020 presidential campaign on wire fraud and money laundering conspiracy charges. The prosecutors alleged that Bannon's crowdfunding We Build the Wall campaign raised more than $25 million from Trump's supporters and used hundreds of thousands of dollars for personal expenses. Bannon was arrested while on board the yacht of a Chinese billionaire. He pleaded not guilty. In November of 2020, 2 months before leaving office, Trump began a pardon spree that would last for several months. As reported by the AP, Trump began by pardoning Michael Flynn, who had pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI in the Russia probe. On December 22nd of 2020, as reported by Reuters, Trump then pardoned George Papadopoulos, who also pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI in the Russia probe. The next day, on December 23rd, 2020, as reported by CNN, Trump issued 26 more pardons, including for Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, both of whom, as noted earlier, were convicted by juries of multiple crimes. Trump also pardoned Charles Kushner, who was the father of Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who had been prosecuted in the early 2000s for tax evasion, witness tampering, and illegal campaign contributions. In the midst of all this, while Trump was busy pardoning his criminal associates, on January 13th of 2021, as reported by PBS News, Trump was impeached for a second time in the House in connection with the attack on the Capitol on January 6, which made Trump the first president to be impeached twice. Trump ultimately was acquitted in the Senate, but 7 Republican senators voted to convict, which was the most bipartisan impeachment vote in the Senate to that time. I covered this second impeachment in detail in my last video, episode 3. And finally, as reported by Politico and Vox, on January 20th of 2021, with only hours to go before leaving office, Trump pardoned 74 more people and commuted the sentences of 70 others, including politically connected business moguls, real estate barons, and disgraced former members of Congress. As reported by CNN, Trump also pardoned his former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, who had just been indicted 5 months earlier for fraud in connection with the We Build the Wall crowdfunding campaign. And as a result of the pardon, Bannon would no longer have to stand trial on federal charges, but state charges were still possible. And as a postscript, in February of 2025, as reported by PBS News, Bannon pleaded guilty to state charges in New York for defrauding donors in the We Build the Wall campaign. Now, it's important to note that the Constitution places almost no limits on presidential pardons for federal crimes, and past presidents have made controversial pardons as well. But Trump used his power to the extreme. As reported by CNN, Trump almost never consulted with the Justice Department's clemency office. In addition, many of Trump's pardons seem to undermine the rule of law. For example, as noted earlier, there was concern during the Russia probe that Trump may have obstructed justice by urging ex-aides not to cooperate with the investigation, and appeared to be dangling pardons in exchange for their loyalty. Nevertheless, Trump carried through with his pardons of former aides Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, Michael Flynn, and George Papadopoulos, all of whom were convicted of lying or obstructing the Mueller probe, among other crimes. In May of 2020, as reported by PBS News, the D.C. Attorney General settled a lawsuit in which the Trump Organization and Presidential Inaugural Committee were required to pay $750,000 to resolve allegations that they illegally misused nonprofit funds to enrich the Trump family. The settlement did not include an admission of guilt by Trump. In June of 2022, as reported by Axios, the House Oversight Committee launched an investigation into Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who established a new private equity fund which accepted about $2 billion from Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund just 6 months after Trump left office. After Republicans gained control of the House in 2023, committee Democrats asked Republican Chairman James Comer to use his subpoena power to further the probe. But as reported by Newsweek, in March of 2024, House Republicans voted down the motion. Kushner denied any wrongdoing. Nevertheless, as reported by The Hill, Chairman Comer, a Republican from Kentucky, said that Kushner crossed the line of ethics by accepting the $2 billion investment. And former Republican Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey was more blunt. As reported by MSNBC, during a town hall, Christie asked his audience rhetorically whether they thought Jared Kushner received $2 billion from the Saudis because he was some kind of investing genius, or because he was sitting next to Donald Trump for 4 years doing favors for the Saudis. Christie concluded that the grift from the Trump family was, as Christie put it, breathtaking. In October of 2022, as reported by PBS News, Steve Bannon, the longtime ally of President Trump, who earlier was indicted for and then pardoned in the We Build the Wall crowdfunding episode, was sentenced to 4 months in prison after defying a subpoena from the House committee investigating the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. In December of 2022, as reported in the Washington Post, a House committee finally obtained 6 years of Trump's tax returns, which he previously had refused to make public by falsely claiming that he couldn't do so because they were under audit. As reported by NBC News, the returns showed that in 2020, Donald and Melania Trump reported $78 million in gross income from 16 foreign countries where Trump had properties or other interests, including $6.5 million from China. In addition, the New York Times reported that Donald Trump paid only $750 in federal income taxes the year he won the presidency, and paid no income taxes at all in 10 of the previous 15 years. Trump dismissed the New York Times report as fake news and maintained that he paid his taxes. In May of 2023, as reported by the AP, a jury in Manhattan found Donald Trump liable for sexually abusing advice columnist E. Jean Carroll in 1996, awarding her $5 million. The day after the verdict, Trump made additional derogatory comments about Carroll, so she amended her original defamation suit to include the additional comments. In January of 2024, a jury in this second action awarded Carroll $83.3 million in total damages, including punitive damages. Trump appealed these decisions. In June of 2023, as reported by the AP and CNN, Trump was indicted for allegedly mishandling classified documents after leaving the presidency. The charges included willful retention of national defense information and obstruction of justice. A grand jury issued a subpoena for any remaining documents in Trump's possession, and Trump certified that he returned all the documents, but the FBI later obtained evidence that he intentionally moved documents to hide them from his lawyers. The FBI then searched Trump's home at Mar-a-Lago and recovered over 13,000 government documents, over 300 of which were classified. Trump pleaded not guilty. In November of 2022, the FBI investigation was taken over by Special Counsel Jack Smith. The federal judge hearing the case was Aileen Cannon, who was randomly assigned. She was appointed to her lifetime post by Trump in 2020, which many felt created the appearance of a conflict of interest. Indeed, CNN reported that two of Cannon's colleagues, including the chief judge, suggested that she should decline to oversee the classified documents case, but she refused. Instead, as reported by the Boston Globe and Politico, Judge Cannon promptly took actions that delayed the trial and was accused by some of slow-walking the case against Trump to avoid going to trial before the election. Then in July of 2024, as reported by Newsweek, Judge Cannon ignored historical precedent and dismissed the case altogether on the grounds that Special Counsel Jack Smith's appointment violated the Appointments Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Special Counsel Jack Smith appealed that decision, and the appeal was still pending at the time of my speech in September of 2024. In August of 2023, as reported by the AP, a grand jury in Washington, D.C. indicted Trump for trying to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Trump pleaded not guilty. I discussed this indictment in my last video, episode 3. Also in August of 2023, as reported by the AP, Trump was indicted by a grand jury in Georgia along with 18 other defendants for attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election in that state. Trump pleaded not guilty in the Georgia case. I discussed that indictment in my last video, episode 3, as well. In February of 2024, as reported by the AP, a judge ordered Trump to pay $355 million in a civil fraud judgment for lying about his wealth. Trump was accused of engaging in financial fraud by presenting vastly different property values to potential lenders and tax officials. Judge Arthur Engoron concluded that the defendants submitted blatantly false financial data and assessed Trump and his companies $355 million for disgorgement of ill-gotten gains, not including interest. Trump appealed the decision. And in May of 2024, as reported by the AP, a jury in New York unanimously found Donald Trump guilty of 34 felony crimes in an election interference and hush money trial, making Trump the first former president to be convicted of a felony crime. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg had charged Trump with falsifying business records in a scheme to influence the 2016 election by concealing payments to the pornographic film actress Stormy Daniels to ensure her silence about an alleged sexual affair with Trump. The indictment was the first of a former president. Trump pleaded not guilty. As reported by the AP and Politico, the jury issued a unanimous verdict finding Trump guilty, making him the first former president to become a convicted felon. Trump appealed the verdict, and sentencing in the case was delayed until after the November 5th presidential election. That concluded my timeline, but to sum up, I shared the views of a growing number of Republicans about Donald Trump's fitness for office. As reported by CBC News, Adam Kinzinger, former Republican congressman from Illinois and a member of the January 6th Select Committee, said that Trump was the most corrupt person to ever hold office in the United States of America. As reported by Now This Impact, multiple prominent Republicans refused to support Trump. Republican Mayor of Mesa, Arizona, John Giles, for example, said he felt there was a minimum bar for elected officials regarding character, commitment to the rule of law and the Constitution, and he didn't feel that Trump met that low bar. Jeff Duncan, former Republican lieutenant governor of Georgia, said that millions of Republicans were tired of making excuses for Donald Trump's behavior at their churches, in their offices, and at their own kitchen tables, and concluded that enough was enough and the nightmare had to end. And Mike Pence, Donald Trump's own vice president, said he could not in good conscience endorse Donald Trump. As reported by MSNBC, Liz Cheney, former congresswoman from Wyoming and co-chair of the January 6th Select Committee, not only said that she would not be voting for Donald Trump, but that she would be voting for Kamala Harris. And finally, in August of 2024, USA Today reported that more than 200 prominent Republicans from the Bush, McCain, and Romney campaigns endorsed Kamala Harris for president in an open letter. The Republicans noted in their letter that they had plenty of honest ideological disagreements with Vice President Harris, but the alternative in Donald Trump was simply untenable. So, okay, that was my speech in a nutshell. My actual speech was 2.5 hours long, while this video and the prior one are only about 60 minutes in the aggregate. So I've presented less than half of my original speech, but hopefully that was enough to convey my concerns about Donald Trump. At the conclusion of my speech, I endorsed Democratic candidate Kamala Harris for president, noting that, in my view, Trump's incitement of the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6 and long history of grift, corruption, and unethical conduct made him unfit to be president of the United States. Like the 200 Republicans who signed an open letter endorsing Kamala Harris, I too had some ideological disagreements with the Democratic ticket. But Donald Trump was simply inconsistent with my values as a political moderate. In my view, as I noted in my first video, political moderates believe in democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law. But I find that hard to reconcile with Trump's attempt to halt the peaceful transfer of power on January 6. Moderates also want to base decisions on proven facts and science, and not on political rhetoric and conspiracy theories. And once again, this seems inconsistent with Trump's promotion of the big lie about the stolen 2020 election. And finally, moderates want their political leaders to act ethically and with integrity at all times, which seems completely incompatible with the lengthy Donald Trump corruption timeline that I presented in my speech. And finally, in addition to endorsing Kamala Harris, I also endorsed Democrat Janelle Stelson for Congress over Republican Scott Perry in Pennsylvania's 10th Congressional District that includes my former hometown of Mechanicsburg, where Perry was the incumbent. I noted that, in my view, Perry's promotion of conspiracy theories about the voting in Pennsylvania and his leadership role in Trump's Stop the Steal campaign made him unfit to represent the area where I was born and raised. As for the reaction to my speech, Capitol reporter Jan Murphy from Penn Live Patriot News covered my effort in an article on September 25th, noting that I had returned to the very same spot where I first had spoken against corruption 46 years earlier. In addition, a few days later on September 30, I followed up my speech and published an op-ed opinion piece with Penn Live Patriot News entitled, "Trump and Perry Are Not Patriots. My Grandmother Was." In that article, I noted that Congressman Perry's campaign website was Patriots for Perry, but argued that Trump and Perry's involvement with the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6 was hardly patriotic. Instead, in my view, my own grandmother, who started the Meals on Wheels program in Mechanicsburg, was more truly a patriot. I'll have more to say about that op-ed and my view of patriotism in a later video. Alas, as we all now know, the 2024 election did not turn out as I had hoped. Donald Trump carried Pennsylvania and was elected president. And to add insult to injury, on his first day in office, as reported by NPR and PBS News, Trump pardoned hundreds of the rioters who were charged with crimes in the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, including many who violently assaulted police officers. More than 140 officers sustained injuries such as cracked ribs, smashed spinal discs, brain injuries, and a heart attack, and several officers later died. Trump called the rioters who caused these injuries patriots, but that was hardly my idea of patriotism. As a postscript, a lot has happened since my speech in September of 2024. After Trump won the 2024 election, as reported by CNN, Special Counsel Jack Smith dropped the election subversion and classified documents cases against Trump because the Department of Justice believed that the Constitution prohibits the continued prosecution of a president who is about to take office. Nevertheless, in January of 2025, as reported by Politico, Special Counsel Jack Smith issued a final report on the DOJ proceedings against Trump and noted that but for Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. In the hush money case in January of 2025, as reported by the AP and ABC News, Judge Merchan finally sentenced Trump, but sentenced him to no punishment. This judgment sidestepped thorny constitutional issues and allowed Trump to return to the White House unencumbered by the threat of a jail term or a fine, but assured that Trump became the first president to take office with a felony conviction on his record. Trump called the case despicable and appealed the ruling. In the civil fraud case, where Trump was ordered to pay $355 million plus interest for lying about his wealth, in August of 2025, as reported by the AP, a New York appeals court ruled that the fine was excessive and threw out the financial penalty, while also upholding the finding that Trump engaged in fraud by exaggerating his wealth for decades. The ruling spares Trump from the fine, but bans him and his two eldest sons from running a business in New York as an officer or director for several years. Trump then filed a notice of appeal to further challenge the decision. In the E. Jean Carroll case on September 8th of 2025, as reported by Reuters, a federal appeals court refused to throw out the $83.3 million jury verdict against President Trump for damaging Carroll's reputation in 2019 when he denied her rape claim. The same court on June 13th upheld Carroll's separate $5 million jury verdict against Trump in May of 2023 for a similar defamation and for sexual assault. Trump indicated he plans to appeal and wants the U.S. Supreme Court to review the E. Jean Carroll case. And finally, in the Georgia election interference case, in October of 2025, as reported by ABC News, a judge ruled that a new prosecutor must be named by November 14th to replace District Attorney Fani Willis, who had a romantic relationship with Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade. If a new prosecutor cannot be named by that date, it's possible the case against all the remaining defendants may be dismissed. And regardless, it seems unlikely that Trump could now be prosecuted since he's the sitting president. In closing, although I now have shared some highlights from my speech about Donald Trump, I feel compelled to say more about why some moderates nevertheless voted for Trump. As a political moderate, I very much want to work together respectfully with people of different viewpoints. I myself did not vote for Donald Trump, but realized that many moderates did, or he would not have been elected. And suffice it to say that I don't hate these Trump supporters. I realize that politics is about making choices, and if some moderates chose Trump over Kamala Harris, then I respect that decision. which was absolutely their right as voters. And with that in mind too, in my next video, episode 5, I will consider why, despite everything I covered in my speech, some moderates nevertheless voted for Trump, and how, regardless, we can all work together going forward to make moderates matter. Thanks for watching.